My name is Benjamin Tallis from the Institute for International Relations, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the second panel of today's conference. We're very lucky to be at a panel where we have three extremely distinguished speakers who will be talking about the domestic determinants of Russia-Ukraine policy. We have Petr Kratochvíl, who is the director of the Institute of International Relations here in Prague. We have Jacek Kucharczyk, who is the president of the executive board of the Institute of Public Affairs in Poland and is also a sociologist and think tanker. And finally we have Lequesne, a professor at CERI-Sciences, and they will be each speaking about different aspects of domestic determinants of current Russia-Ukraine policy, varying from public opinion and the effect that may have in Poland and in Germany, and what indeed similarities and differences may be, and even looking over to actually what Russian public opinion may have as an impact on the current situation. Then looking at varieties of ways in which we can categorize domestic influence and domestic determinants, domestic components of how we understand foreign policy, which very much relates to certain ways of viewing the world through different theories of international relations. And obviously drawing this distinction between the inside, the domestic, and the outside, the international, is one of the key elements in which international relations theory has had contesting views over the last few years, to say the least. So this might be an area in which you would like to address the speakers' points afterwards. And indeed also Lequesne will be speaking about French domestic determinants of current EU and policy on Russia and Ukraine. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, Petr Kratochvíl, please.
Yep, thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. My presentation will not focus so much on the Czech case. I will give some Czech examples, but what I will try to show is some general trends which I think are broadly applicable to virtually all EU member states. So I'll first start by presenting the two dominant narratives that have surrounded the intra-EU discussions about the Ukrainian crisis. I'll start with the first narrative, which claims that Russia is both in the EU as a whole and within each EU member state a divisive issue. The key word here is fragmentation, so both the national political spectrum and the EU spectrum is divided on Russia. We can talk about many things, but whenever we come in Brussels or in the national capitals to discussing Russia and the Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine, problems start there. To prove this point, or to show that there is some kernel of truth in this narrative, I also copied there on the right side the first page of a collective study to which I contributed recently, which explores the views of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict in Central European EU member states. And as you can see, the overall title is A Region Disunited, which proves or shows that for the authors of that study, the main feature when discussing the conflict is that there is not enough unity. Not even when talking about the Visegrad 4 cooperation, which is quite successful in many areas, but as far as Russia or the Ukrainian conflict is concerned, there is much to be desired. This narrative is also very much related to the alliance or alliances of the Kremlin, which the Kremlin has quite successfully forged with a number of populist or extremist movements and parties all across Europe. We can start from Jobbik Party in Hungary up to the National Front in France. So the idea is that Russia is a divisive issue, both in terms of a topic for discussions, but also as the cause of the division that actively contributes to driving wedges into the EU. On the other side, we have the second narrative, which is less often discussed, but I think it should be mentioned here because there is some truth to it as well. And that is the narrative based on the argument that Russia, in fact, can increase or the conflict in Ukraine can to some extent increase the unity within the EU. And there are some very substantial arguments in favor of this narrative. There has been a radical change in several EU member states, radical shift towards the reassessment of their national positions regarding their ties with Russia. Most visibly, it's the case of Germany, which Vladimir Handel already mentioned. The same applies to the Netherlands, and most recently, of course, to the discussion which has started a couple of months ago in the Nordic countries, and their discussion about closer cooperation with NATO, the unidentified swimming objects around their territories, and so on. The strongest argument in favor of this narrative is the story of sanctions. This is something that even Russian media, even the Russian propaganda media like Russia Today, have to reflect. I follow Russia Today very closely. It's quite instructive in many ways. And what is quite striking is that even there, the main tenor has gradually shifted from the claim that sanctions will never be imposed because of the lack of unity to sanctions will not survive for long, to the current, and just yesterday there was a discussion based on the claim that the lack of unity will prevent new EU sanctions. So as you can see, even Russian policymakers and Russian media finally, slowly, gradually come to the conclusion that the sanctions are here, and they are here probably to stay for some time. They have been in place for more than a year today. So we have these two contradictory narratives, and I argue that both of them are present in all our national political debates. And this leads me to the classification which I used in the study I mentioned before. And I think that to some extent this classification is applicable all across the EU. Basically what we have are four groups. Of course they are, some groups are stronger in some countries, weaker in others, but the basic classification I think applies everywhere. I'll start with a relatively small group of what I call the hawks, who are very critical of Russia. They believe that of the Russian involvement in Ukraine. They perceive Russia as an outright enemy. They believe that sanctions are a good thing, but not sufficient, and that is why we should go farther, perhaps aiding militarily the Ukrainian army. EU coordination is a good thing, but sometimes we have to go it alone or perhaps cooperate with the United States at the expense of the EU. Typical examples of this position in the Czech Republic would be the two right-wing parties, TOP 09 and the ODS. Then we have the second group, which I call multilateralists, and that's those who believe that it is very important to take coordinated action within the EU. So EU coordination is essential. EU is doing relatively well in their views. Sanctions are unfortunate, but still the only available diplomatic or less diplomatic tool that unfortunately has to be necessarily applied. And this is the position that is typical for this institution where we are now sitting in, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Minister, and for some smaller Czech parties like the Greens or the Christian Democrats. Then the third group is what I call the pragmatists, and this is the group, and that's the blue circle, because I believe that this is the dominant position in the Czech Republic. And these are even more cautious about the sanctions. They still comply with them because they are, there is the EU mainstream, so they are very pragmatic in their attitude towards the EU. That also means that no military aid is considered by them. EU coordination is good, but the main problem or main concern for them is economy. Russia is perceived as a potential market, and sanctions are something that hampers our economic relations. So these pragmatists could be also seen as the economic utilitarians. All they care about is the exports, trade, investment, unemployment. And that's the typical position of both the Czech Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance and their respective parties, Social Democrats and the ANO party. And this, I believe, is the dominant position here, unlike in some other Central European countries, and I'm sure Jacek will be talking about that later. And finally, we have a relatively small, but at least in the Czech Republic, very vocal group of Friends of Russia. There is a Facebook page. It's officially Friends of Russia, and all of them are members of that Facebook site. So whoever wants to know who belongs there, just have a look. Of course, they are very their line is very pro-Kremlin. Russia is seen not as an enemy or a rival. It's a potential ally. Of course, the sanctions are bad, and basically their attitude would be replicating the official Russian discourse in many ways. Typical, the most typical or the most visible representative of that group is our president, Miloš Zeman, even though even there is some hesitation. For those of you who are not from the Czech Republic, I should perhaps mention a recent blunder of the Russian media. They aired a document on the 1968 invasion by the Warsaw Pact armies to Czechoslovakia, explaining the audience that it was because there was an imminent fascist coup in the country, and that the armies, of course, prevented the arrival of the NATO armies plus these fascists. And this is, of course, something that is not acceptable, not even for our president. So even he somewhat distanced himself from this group. But still, this group, even though it's relatively small, is highly influential, highly visible in the public debates. So my overall argument would be that the mainstream in the EU is that's the yellow circle. So looking at the Czech position, surprisingly, it would be more pro-Russian than what I perceive as EU mainstream, which goes contrary to, and to your question, contrary to the received wisdom about where the Czech Republic stands. And my final slide is that generally what we see here and of what the discussion about the Ukrainian conflict is just a symptom are two intertwined processes. The first is strong domestic polarization plus more visibility of domestic political debates. And at the same time, there is a transnational alliance building, both of the supporters and the opponents of the Kremlin policies in Ukraine, and that is you know, to conclude on a more positive note, that is, I believe, the silver lining of the whole situation. I believe that what we see here is a first sign of a very thin emergence of a very thin European public sphere, because here what we see is we cannot really talk about national positions on some issues, national position on migration, on the Ukrainian crisis, but more transnational alliances on migration, on Russia. You know, many of you know that it was Marine Le Pen who visited Prague a couple of weeks ago, looking for such an alliance exactly on these topics. So this is, of course, in a very critical situation, but at the same time what we see here is politicization of the EU debate, which I think is a very good sign for the future. So not all is bad, but I'd like to end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Petr, and indeed that last point really raises the question about this distinction between the domestic and the international and the potential blurring of them, and also about how we actually transfer domestic concerns to multinational, supranational, and indeed then international level. Thank you very much indeed. I will now hand over to Jacek Kucharczyk.
Yes, thank you for the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to share some of the results of the research that we have recently conducted on precisely this topic, the topic of this panel. The research I'm mentioning here, and which will be the focal point of my presentation, concerned the responses of the public opinion in Poland and in Germany, the responses towards the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, as well as we also tried to take some measure of the Russian responses, which goes a bit beyond the scope of this panel. So if time allows, I will show you some of the results from the Russian part of the study, but our focus was actually on the issue of how close or how far apart are the publics, not so much the governments, but the publics in Poland and in Germany in terms of their attitudes towards Russia after the events or during the events in Ukraine. We took the study was basically a standard public opinion surveys conducted in Poland and in Germany on 1,000 people representative sample. In Russia, and the study was conducted by the renowned Levada Center. It was slightly larger sample, and what's important, the time when the fieldwork was done was almost immediately after the Minsk II agreement, but before the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, which had quite a strong echo in Germany, less so in Poland. I think that in Poland we were less surprised by this, because this kind of fits better into our view of what Russian politics looks like. But in Germany, our hypothesis was that it would, if we did it a week later, the results could be even more striking, but even at this moment, I think that the major finding from this survey is to deny our working hypothesis, or really more like what I think Petr just called the received knowledge or received wisdom about the differences between Poland and Germany, and this wisdom is quite strongly held in Poland especially, and this is that Poland is pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian, and Polish public is very strongly pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian, and with German public is pro-Russian basically. So this is the stereotype that we were trying to verify during this study, and to see to what extent really these big differences, these alleged big differences between the two public opinions exist. And I can already tell you at this place that what we found out, that this stereotype is far from being truth, which does not mean that it's the opposite way and that there are no differences. And you will see that on some aspects of the public opinion there are still significant differences between Poles and Germans. But what was more striking, and I think it is a very good illustration of what Petr just said about European publics in general, is this strong domestic polarization of the public opinion in not only in how to assess the situation, but also and more importantly how we should respond to this situation in terms of policy response. So starting with the question about the assessment of the current state of relations between a given country, so Poland and Russia and Germany and Russia. This was the first surprise, because as you see here, the assessment of the state of relations are not so different in Poland and in Germany. So you see that a large majority of Germans think that relations between the two countries are bad, and in the same way the large majority of Poles think that relations between Poland and Russia are in a bad state. The significant difference is that more Poles believe that they are very bad, but again, this was the first example that on this very general level, the assessment of bilateral relations with our big eastern neighbor is quite similar. Here we have a follow-up to this first slide, which shows a change of public opinion in Germany. As it happens, we asked the same question in a German survey in 2013, and here you can see that the change is quite significant, with significantly higher number of Germans now saying that relations are bad. In 2013 there was 45% of Germans who would define the relations as rather good. This number has shrunk to 15%. So that shows you how German public opinion actually reacts to the developments and follows the developments. Another question which, again, in my view, reveals interesting similarities and also differences between Poles and Germans as regards the assessment of the causes of the conflict in Ukraine. As you see, we asked who is responsible for the conflict. And here Polish public opinion is relatively clear. I say relatively clear because, again, one might expect, looking at public debate in Poland, one might expect that this number of people blaming Russia for the conflict would be even higher than 61%, which you see here. And that basically, even on this very sort of, I would assume, a simple question, you would have quite a strong division, relatively strong division of opinion in Poland, and even more strongly divided public opinion in Germany. So interestingly enough, in Germany, the largest group, the plurality of respondents, said that blame lies on both sides, but almost the same group said that Russia is mainly to blame. And one similarity between Polish and German response is that there were relatively few people who would say that Ukraine is mainly to blame for the conflict. And again, so you see that the differences notwithstanding, there is at least some common ground in assessing the situation between the two societies. Here is another question, and in this case there is a rather clear difference of perception between Poles and German. We ask a direct question about military threat. Does Russia in this context pose a military threat to Poland and to Germany? So we asked Poles about threat to Poland and the Germans about threat to Germany, and here you see that there is a difference in threat perception. In Poland, if you add the first two numbers, it's 76% who thinks that Russia is militarily threatening Poland. At this time in Germany, is significantly fewer people agree with this statement. But I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that only 13% of Germans stated that Russia is definitely not a military threat. And as for a country which is famously named or the population, the Germans are often described as people who live in a post-security mentality. I think that this alone will show you that this post-security mentality has been shaken by this crisis, even though there is not such a big perception of threat as in Poland. It's quite significant, I would say, if you look at the starting point. Now, the crucial difference in perception and basically the starting point of our hypothesis is the perception whether Poland and Germany have similar or diverging interests vis-à-vis Russia. And as you see that what has changed over the last 2 years is that indeed more people in Poland see the interests as divergent. This is less so the case in Germany, but we also see the interest as divergent. But even then, again, the Polish public at least is quite divided. So there is a large group of people who think that we have similar interests with Germany, and the cooperation with Germany was one of the foundations of Polish policy towards the crisis. And another interesting question, and I thought key question, is about the sanctions. And again, you would expect, looking at public opinion in Poland, that the German public is against the sanctions. But if you look at these figures, is that you will get the largest number of people in Germany who are in favor of maintaining the sanctions. This is 44%, and identical group of respondents in Germany who are in favor of strengthening the sanctions or easing the sanctions. This is 23%. So I mean, you can always do all kinds of things with numbers, but you would see that only 1/5 of German public at that time was in favor of easing the sanctions, which I think is quite interesting, and that in sort of the broad, if you take the broader view of this issue, you will see that there is more in common between Polish and German attitudes towards the sanction than one might presume. And broadly speaking, there seems to be a kind of consensus that the sanctions should be at least maintained. Again, very broad similarity, support for economic assistance to Ukraine, almost identical responses. A majority of people in Poland and Germany favor support economic assistance, but again, when we ask about military assistance, which would include sending equipment and training, not your own troops, but equipment and training, you will see that majority in Poland and in Germany are against this policy. So once again, there is not a policy difference, at least in public opinion perceptions. The difference clearly is that there is a bigger group of Poles who would support military assistance than German, and stronger opposition in Germany. But again, you might say that the majorities in both countries are of similar view. And this is I think, one of the most interesting responses to a bit tricky question. So what should be, should we support Ukraine even if at the price of deteriorations of relations with Russia? And quite surprisingly to me, in Poland the number of people who are in favor of supporting Ukraine dramatically decreases. In Germany as well, and as you see in Germany there is a skeptical majority, a small but a small majority, only half of the respondents, who say that we shouldn't pay this price, which sort of contradicts to the previous statements, but I think it shows you how volatile and how divided public opinions in both countries are, and I think it's again illustrates well Petr's thesis of domestic polarization. Another surprise, lack of support for abolishing visa for Ukrainians in both Poland and Germany. Again, the difference is that in Germany the opposition is really strong. In Poland it's not a majority who are opposed, but it's again there are more people against than in favor. So that's there is more results in the report, which is online. So if you want to have more closer analysis of these results, but I think that in general it shows you that contrary to some stereotypes, Polish public opinion is united basically in the sense of a threat from the East, but is completely disunited in case of how to respond to this threat. And I just wanted to show you just two slides from Russia, the most interesting findings. This is one finding is that there is the Russians also see the relations between Poland and Russia and Germany in Russia as prevailingly bad, in a bad state. So here the three countries, the public opinions have the same assessment of the state of our relations. But in terms of threat perception, you see that neither Poland and Germany, probably for different reasons, is perceived as a threat to Russia. The US is, of course, the main threat, with almost more than 2/3 of Russians agreeing that this is a threat. And this is the most surprising part of this survey. We asked the question about Russian support for separatists in eastern Ukraine, whether Russia should support them or not. And as you see, the Russian public opinion was almost evenly split on this issue, with a large section, actually the biggest group, said that Russia should neutral vis-à-vis the conflict. Interestingly, this was one of the questions in which gender played a role, with a clear majority of women being in favor of neutrality and the majority of men being in favor of intervention. But when we ask people what sort of intervention they would accept, and the question was asked only to those who said that Russia should intervene, but this is recalculated on the basis of the entire sample. So you would see that the number, out of the entire sample, the number of respondents who said that Russia should send troops into Ukraine is only 7%. And I think it also puts in a very interesting light the Russian propaganda and insistence that there are no Russian troops in Ukraine, because contrary to the high ratings of President Putin, this policy wouldn't be very popular in Russia, according to this sample. And the two last questions about sanctions, how they affect Russian economy, and as you see, again, Russian public is quite divided, but there are large groups of the opinion which say that at least some deterioration of the situation was caused by the sanctions, and there is more than 1/3 who think that the sanctions had a strong negative impact. And even the counter-sanctions imposed by Russia as a penalty on the Western states, there is almost half of respondents who think that these sanctions that Mr. Putin imposed as retaliation, that they're hurting both sides, not only the West. So in this sense, they may not be most productive. So it again, I think that it nicely illustrates that the Russian public is not maybe as much united behind Putin's policies as the received wisdom would imply. Since my time is running out, I will finish here. Maybe if you have some questions about how this public opinion translates into Polish politics, I will be happy, or indeed any other questions, I will be happy to answer. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Jacek. And I think, yes, the part of the reason for having this conference today is exactly problematizing these issues that people know that everybody knows, and they know the standard received wisdoms, and exactly this kind of data can really provoke us to think differently on those things. And I would encourage everyone in the room to think not only about the data that was presented, but also to think, where do these opinions come from, on what are they based, and also then what impact do they have, what do we do with them, and what do people do with them? And how do they go about actually translating these different opinions into policy practice, or into indeed living differently perhaps? I certainly have a question for you later about post-security culture. With that said, I will pass on to Christian Lequesne.
Thank you very much, Ben. You know, nowadays there are two kinds of presentation, the one with PowerPoint and the other one without PowerPoint. My presentation will be without. I apologize for that. And I would like to start by a remark about the way we are talking in France, well, currently, about Russia and Ukraine. I'm struck that it's not so much at the center of the public debate compared to other topics. If you compare, for instance, the information about Daesh, about the Middle East, we have much more than about Ukraine and Russia. Of course, there are probably some explanations about that. The first is that some of our military forces and air force is committed, engaged in the Middle East with the US Air Force, and probably more importantly, the fact that around 1,000 French citizens are currently in Daesh, and this is something the press is, of course, covering much more than what is going on in Ukraine for the moment. If we take now the position of the government, we talk a lot about public opinion. I'm going to take the level of the government, which is currently a center-left government. I very much agree with what Jacques said this morning. This question of Ukraine, Russia, for the French diplomacy is something which has to be dealt inside the EU and with the Germans. I'm not sure that the French diplomacy is considering that the Weimar Triangle is so important, because when you see the pressures which were exercised by Putin for not having the pause in the negotiation, it was clear that in Paris we did accept it, and maybe more strikingly in Berlin as well. I don't have the impression that the Germans do push a lot to have the Weimar Triangle when Putin said that, well, you know, you understand his logic, I have to deal with states which are strong enough for me, and Germany and France are acceptable. When we are now taking the question of which foreign policy inside the EU, well, it's a clear balancing act between what I would call the answer to the normative agenda of values on one side and interests on the other side. Petr qualified the Czech, the mainstream position, as a pragmatic one, or the pragmatist. I would say the same for the French position. Acceptance of sanctions, but on the other way, all the time a reflection about the possible counter-cyclic effects of sanctions, etc. So it's to a certain extent very different from some position coming, well, some political forces in the Baltic states and in Poland or in United States, presenting more the sanction as well, a demonstration of strength against Putin's demonstration of strength. You know, no, we don't have this. We don't have really this this debate. It's very interesting to see that nobody is able to calculate the effects in economic terms of the sanctions. So we see the forecast of the Commission, the last forecast, said that it has an impact of 0.3% of the GDP for the whole EU investment in Russia. But the French firms, or some of the French firms, started to calculate now and sent regular forecasts to the French Ministry of Economics and to the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But if you take the lobbying of the French firms, it's probably not the same format than what you have in Germany with the Ostausschuss, for instance. Also because the interests are not the same. There are less French investments in Russia than German, and we are not so concerned by the energy issue, of course. Inside the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is this idea now that sanctions had political effects on what happened in Donbass, and that it was a sort of limitation for Putin in going too far in the project of Novorossiya. I don't know if it's true, but this is something we can hear on a regular basis expressed by the diplomat. What also strikes me is, and this is probably confirmed also by the opinion polls we saw in other EU member states, there is a very small confidence vis-à-vis Ukraine and vis-à-vis the stability of the economic and political system. And here the lobbying coming from the French business is also an important element to take into consideration. Government is very sensitive to what is said. Well, this business is not so developed in Ukraine, but it concerns two sectors. The first one is banking. BNP, Crédit Agricole are in Ukraine, and the other sector is agribusiness. But you have kind of messages from the businessman which are very, very negative about Ukraine, and this is something which probably has an impact also on the perception of the politicians and of the diplomats. Let me move now to the security issue, and in the security issue we also find this compromise all the time between values, normative agenda, and interest on the other side. Of course, the most explicit example is the Mistral ships, and it had an impact on the relationship with the EU partners. Well, a year ago, the question in Paris was still, are we going to sell it or not? I remember very well the debate in 2014. You have to consider that the Russian government has already paid 3/4 of the first ship. The amount is 1.2 billion. Now I have to say that the debate is different. The debate is, what are we going to do with a boat that will not be sold to Russia? And it's interesting to see how the governmental sources are discreet on that, because I think they don't know what they're going to do. You have probably several possibilities. One is to reform the boat and to send it to a third country. I'm not talking about the hypothesis, which was a joke, but giving it to the EU. But there is a third possibility, which is probably just destroy it. Of course, it was a hot potato for the current government, because the contract was signed by the previous president of the republic. So this is, you see, a good example of how the normative agenda played a role on a decision by the government. On the other way, the general feeling inside the administration is that no weapon has to be sold to Ukraine, and this is very similar to what we also hear in Germany. And vis-à-vis the EU and the NATO membership, so the perspectives, here again I think the French are very much in the middle, because on one way they see the polls in Ukraine which say that the Ukrainians are more and more in favor of joining the EU and joining the NATO, so they have to take it into consideration. On the other side, they don't want to accept what Putin wants, so a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. Okay, so what is the outcome of that? Well, we don't really talk about that, you know, and we consider that it is not an issue for the moment, but. Of course, I think everybody knows that this question will come back in the future. What about, and I'm going to finish with that, what about, public opinion? Well, I think public opinion is probably not very different from what we see in the polls about Germany in particular, but what is interesting in France is that at the level of the elites, politicians, think tanks, public intellectuals, you have an old tradition of Russophilia, which is very well used by the current Russian diplomacy. There is a real public diplomacy of Russia in France. Well, I call it public diplomacy, it's a very soft word to say propaganda. There is in Paris an institute which is headed by a former member of the Duma, who is an historian known for a revised conception of 20th century Russian history. And when you see the people who are attending what she's organizing, well, you could be very struck that it's, of course, it's the people from the extremes, and I will say a word about that, but it's also old-fashioned Gaullists for, obvious reasons, and the left of the left, okay? And it's clear that there is a real public diplomacy, and also vis-à-vis the Eurosceptics, in general, people who do not like Europe and people who do not like the United States. Okay, and somebody said in the debate this morning that it has been well described. I'm not sure that it's so well described. And then we will have probably to do a study, a comparative study, on the way, Putin's Russia is doing alliance compromises with extreme both right and left. Front National, who is our far-right party and who is around 15–20% in the polls, got a loan from a Czech Russian bank, but the funds are mostly Russian. And Mrs. Le Pen, of course, visited Moscow. But I think you have a former president in this country who is also very close to this kind of networks. Well, I don't want to, and I would like to finish the politicians, both center-right and center-left. They are really in this pragmatic mood, you know, and I don't want to say that they pursue a pure interest-based policy or a pure value-based policy. The normative agenda, of course, plays a role, but interest is also there, and this is an accommodation all the time between both, and it's very interesting to see how diplomats are talking about that between themselves. But it creates a sort of critique among retired diplomats in particular, who were educated on the Gaullist mood of thinking, because for them everything which was a source of independence vis-à-vis the United States was good, okay, and Russia was part of that, which is finished now with the new generation of diplomats. So it's very interesting to see how the senior diplomats comment the current French foreign policy and what the younger colleagues are doing. And usually they use the word neocons. They are neocons. That's the critique. And you can find it in the press, the neocons versus the Gaullist or the Gaullo-Mitterrandist, as we said in the paradigm in the French press. I'm just finishing saying that vis-à-vis the US in particular, I have the impression that the actor which is important for the settlement of this Ukraine-Russian crisis is first of all Berlin. This is the way Washington DC is thinking. When for Daesh it is more on the Middle East, it is more Paris, and the relations on the Middle East between Paris and Washington is not bad at all. It's very close, okay? And of course the French are very happy that it's not the British, for obvious reasons, because the Brits always claim that they have this privileged relationship, which is probably not the case anymore, because I don't think Washington DC is thinking in terms of privilege relationship anymore. So one thing which strikes me also, and I'm going to finish on that, is the relative absence of London in this Ukrainian-Russian crisis. And I know that this is a source of debate in the UK. So it's also a question I would like to put for the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian, and I think stealing remorselessly from a brief remark from our director at the moment, you may have coined a new word for us here in the Czech Republic of the Klausel-Zemanite position, which perhaps we might like to expand and explore. I'd like to thank all three of the panelists for really interesting presentations which address aspects of the issue of domestic influence on foreign policy in different ways. And I will just have a couple of brief remarks before we open the floor up to your questions and comments. So be sharpening your minds and pencils while I'm giving some structuring comments. I'd like us to think a little bit about what we mean when we talk about the domestic, and Petr's presentation and also Jacek's presentation really talked about how we need to get beyond the idea of a monolith. It is not only single opinions, there are conflicting opinions, but also cohesive groups and cohesive formations, and how we go about understanding those different formations within a domestic sphere is extremely important. Do we actually see the domestic as this space of politics, actually as the crucial space of politics where contestation and difference can actually be negotiated, and how does that then transfer into dealing with the international? And exactly these emergence of transversal groupings that cross and blur the boundaries of our domestic international divisions, raise a lot of questions about that. When we look at how this has happened, it links back to perhaps the role of politics and political leadership, which Lucia's presentation spoke to this morning, and how we can see that public opinion may indeed play a part, but rather than just following, there is a role for political leadership that perhaps we can see as being distinctly lacking in certain wider understandings of the European public sphere in particular at the moment. And to speak to Christian's point, indeed, the lack of any British meaningful public intervention on the Russia-Ukraine crisis is not only a source of consternation in the UK within its own domestic sphere, but also certainly here in the Czech Republic as well, and in other V4 countries, where and why the UK absence is being so keenly felt is something I would be very interested to hear from you about. But moreover, when we think about a domestic and an international distinction, do we still think about the domestic as this safe, knowable, manageable inside, which we contrast with the less safe, the dangerous, the different, the less knowable outside? And where do we draw those distinctions in terms of how we go about managing these issues, particularly in a Europe where we've had a domestication of foreign policy and a domestication of relations between European countries, and the attempt to also spread that to a certain extent to our neighbourhood, so drawing back to the panel this morning, but also how that relates to other domestic spheres, which we'll link to the panel later this afternoon, about Russia. And this was extremely interesting from Jacek's presentation, looking at Russian public opinion. When we're talking about our domestic, we shouldn't forget other people have their domestics as well, and so we need to consider again the interaction between the two. On a final point from me, and particularly as you mentioned, a post-security culture, in defining what we actually consider to be our domestic realm, we can see the way in which we understand threats and perhaps the different threat perception between Germany and Poland that you mentioned before, between different V4 countries and France, as was also mentioned by Christian, and indeed in the different groups that Petr identified. How we actually understand what these threats are tells us an awful lot about who we think we are, and about what we hold important, and about how we seek to go and act in the world, which in turn has an effect on creating who we are. So how we actually respond to perceived security threats, which are often of a quasi-existential nature, may really be very crucial in understanding how we transfer the domestic to the international. Very finally, from my side, did the Germans really become post-security, or did they do security differently? Did they start to see security differently? And I point to the statistic about visas and migration. This is a different kind of fear, it's a different kind of calculation that plays into another kind of security concern, which we've seen in a widening of what we understand as security, which broadens our instruments to be able to deal with it, but at the same time further complicates the world in we are dealing in. So with that said, can I get an idea from the room about how many people would like to ask questions? Okay, we have 1, 2, looking down this side, 3, 4. All right, we'll take these 4 questions first, and then hopefully we'll come back to another round. I would ask you please to identify yourselves before asking your question, and if indeed you do want to address it to a particular member of the panel, please say so. So first, please, Henry.
Dr. Kratochvíl, I entirely, Henry Matisiver, Prague Security Studies Institute. Dr. Kratochvíl, I entirely agree with you that the film which you referred to is the Russian Jurassic Park Ltd. Film made for the Russian Jurassic Park Ltd. community. However, as an enthusiastic consumer of the Czech language media, I'm rather surprised that none of the journalists or commentators picked up on 2 important points in that film. Number one, who was it made for and by whom it was made? And if you want to find out look at the credits. And the second thing, that there was a very important statement in that film made by former French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Roland Dumas. Now, the question, Mr. Kucharczyk, your country stated on several occasions that you're going to stick to the Schengen visa rules and regulations. Yet, the official Ukrainian press agency, Union, announced that in 2014, the country issues twice as many bilateral visas, whatever that means, than the year before. Would you like to comment on this? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Just to clarify, the film you were referring to was the film about 1968. Is that the... No?
It was a film about the Warsaw Pact, and 1968 was in it.
Okay.
Well, but it was half of the movie, yeah.
Okay, so I think we can loosely refer to it as indeed the Warsaw Pact 68 movie, to use our new conjunctions. Okay, please, to my left, there was another question.
Thank you. Michal Ramanto, Faculty of Social Sciences. I have 2 questions. One is for all panelists. First of all, it was very interesting, but in every single presentation it was possible to observe that there are differences in countries where surveys were made. But there is one monolithic Russia. Don't you think that it is a problem, especially for the future? Because there are differences, for example, between Bush and Obama America. But there is still Putin as a head of Russia for 15 years, and who knows for how many years to come. So what do we know about Russia? How can we include into our investigation some possible change in Russia do you think that if Russia will be a normal state with opposition and with normal election, that the public opinion, for example, will be different? That's my first question. And my second question is to Professor Lequesne. Thank you very much about that part in your presentation about Mistral ships. And I would like to know something about the position of French oil tycoon Total, because according to Russian press, Total is going to ignore sanctions because of its contracts in Russia. So if you have any information about this, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Lucia, National, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for very interesting presentations. Now, the first question goes to France. In Central Europe, we often hear, oh, those French don't care about Eastern Europe, so why should we care about the Mediterranean? This is very often, I mean, the diplomatic and political argument in this part of the world. My question is, how is this reflected? Is it at all reflected in French policy formulation towards Eastern Europe? I mean, very often when you are sitting in ministries in Bratislava, Prague, or Warsaw, there's this push for us having to be in the forefront of Eastern policy because the French eyes are turned somewhere else. So when Paris is talking about its Eastern policy or Southern policy, do you feel that the debate is reflecting the fact that in the East, the Southern element is absent? So that would be because the handful of us who are interested in the South are very often sent to France to do politics there. So that's why I'm asking. And second question is more broad, and I will pick up on what Petr was saying and Benjamin was saying on transnationalism. And I think that we are facing two countercurrents. On the one hand, obviously, these ideational groups are transnational. There are many people in the Czech Republic, in France, and in Germany who are going to share exactly the same thinking, great migration. Regardless of the fact that they were brought up in different places, they speak different languages, etc., but they are going to be either supporters of more refugee-friendly policy or opponents. And they basically do not feel to have anything in common with their patriots, with their co-patriots, who feel otherwise. At the same time, I think that there is a lot of merit in what Benjamin suggested, that the domestic is still for many the realm of the knowable. And it has a lot to do with the security, and a lot of the anti-migrant and similar discourses, xenophobic discourses, are not framed with ill intention, but basically they are, reflex of fear. And where I'm going with this question is, do you see opportunities for transnational political leadership given the state of the affairs? I'll cut it here, thanks.
Superb, thank you very much indeed. Yes, from two cultures, two kingdoms to a potential European public sphere. Thank you. Okay, Vladimir Handel.
Thank you, Ben. One question for everybody. It's what we see in Vladimir Putin's project for Russia is not only politics, it's also a cultural project. It's a cultural conservative turn in Russian politics and anti-liberal, homophobic, etc. So how appealing this culture turn is in your countries? It's interesting to know. And the second question is rather for Christian, and it's on the invitation by some Russian politicians now to great powers, as they call it, to join them in a recreation of a Vienna Congress of Great Powers, or in creation or negotiation of a new Yalta Agreement number 3, as Alexei Gromyko calls it. German policy is increasingly under pressure to come to some kind of new Molotov-Ribbentrop sort of division of Europe. So is this element part of the French debate as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I know we have one quick remark from Jacek as well.
Well, it was more or less, in fact, what Vladimir Handel has just said. I mean, the new ideological twist of the Putin discourse and the way it resonates in certain circles. You know, the idea that there is we are the last bastion of defending conservative national Christian values against this decadent liberal Western and basically weak Europe. The weakness. So the stress on the sovereignty, the power, the conservative versus the decadent, weak, permissive Europe, and that resonates in certain circles. Christian has mentioned them on both on the far right. It resonates actually much more on the far right than on the far left. That is interesting. This is, you know, in the old days, the Moscow used to play on a slightly different audience. This time it addresses explicitly, you know, far right constituencies.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Yes, really an interesting set of questions, and particularly about, in the last case, defining the domestic as the bastion to be defended, the domestic Russia, which may help us to explore why this monolith can perhaps emerge, but also how it can do so without weapons of mass attraction, to use Chris Patton's term, without such a soft power influence. Okay, I would like to ask each of the panelists to take 2 to 3 minutes each to address a selection of the points that have been raised to them, so that we can then actually engage in another short round of questions. And I would ask Petr Kratochvíl to lead off, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting questions. So very briefly, first the Walkerian inside-outside question. I think that it's really paradoxical that in the EU what we have here is that it is the anti-EU forces, many of whom have been elected to the European Parliament, are those who are the leaders in forming these. So we have a transnational alliance against the European supranational structure, which is paradoxical in a way. And in that sense, the pro-European parties are only following in their footsteps, you know, so basically reactive attitude, which may be a problem. But broadly speaking, I think this, as I mentioned in my presentation, this I think is the good thing, somewhere the light at the end of the tunnel, somewhere beyond the horizon, that this is something that is simply happening even not only in academia as an academic topic, but if you look at the, for instance, Czech institutional discussion about whether the European affairs should be part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the office of the government, this clearly reflects the doubts even among policymakers whether perhaps EU issues are not domestic issues there. And the other thing I wanted to very briefly comment on is Vladimir Handel's question on the culture wars. I think that there are two dimensions to that. The first is, of course, the regional post-Soviet dimension, and that is if you look at how Russia can be attractive for the post-Soviet countries. I mean, security, very difficult today because many of those, including Kazakhstan and Belarus, traditional Russian allies are afraid today of the potential future Russian aggression. So security, with the exception of Armenia, no. Economy, of course, Russian economy is stuttering at the moment, so that is out of question too. But of course, these cultural issues. I just returned from Armenia a month ago and talking to the people, asking what is your image of Europe. The first thing they came up with was Conchita Wurst, right? So this idea of these very effeminate Europeans, and we machos here, led by President Putin. Now this, this resonates not so much in the political elite, but in the publics there. So I think that's one dimension. And the second, if you allow me to go a bit into psychoanalysis there, I think if you look at Russia itself, with one of the highest divorce and abortion rates in the world, and certainly in Europe, I think what they are afraid of is themselves, in a sense, right, of their declining demography, of their problems with many of these decadent issues like alcohol, for instance. So that is why it is so successful, because we of course always throw on the external other our own fears, our own problems.
Super, thank you very much indeed. Okay, Jacek, please.
Thank you for this question about the culture wars. I think it's very crucial. It's good it came up. I think I agree this is Putin's secret weapon for post-Soviet area, and in two ways. One is that it creates the image of Europe as basically concerned with gay rights and women's rights and having nothing else to offer, so it is producing the sort of anti-European backlash. But at the same time it's stirring like homophobia in the Eastern Partnership countries, and there is homophobia there, which is undeniable, and which can in turn help to destroy the image of these struggling democracies, let's call them, in the EU. I mean, the right-wing thugs attacking gay parade in Kiev is a good example. I mean, it has to have bearing. I also wanted to add that this is also a soft sort of underbelly of Polish policy vis-à-vis Russia. I mean, this view of Europe as decadent resonates very strongly with some sections of Polish public, and especially with some of the political forces, and they would never admit, even those who are avowedly anti-Russian, like Law and Justice Party, would at the same time have very similar agenda and view of Europe and Europe's liberal values as Mr. Putin. And that was interesting case was when a Polish church, a Catholic church, signed a joint statement with Russian Orthodox Church several years ago. And it was greeted in Poland as an important step in dialogue and mutual understanding, but most of this statement was actually about the need to fight jointly LGBT rights, women's rights, and so on as the main threat to to Christian values in Europe. So that was ironic. So I think this aspect of culture war is very, very important, not only in Eastern Partnership countries, but also in Europe itself. And the second question about visa, as far as I know, the national visa are perfectly in line with Schengen regulations, so I don't see Poland breaking any Schengen rules by issuing, I don't know how many visas, national visas are issued. What is more, Poland has small border traffic agreements with both Ukraine and Russia. Kaliningrad region, people who live there can travel to Poland without any visas, so that's another, and this is again part of the European framework. So, and in general, Polish government is supportive of abolishing visas for all Ukrainians, which I think is the right thing to do, even though we see that those fears about migration are now also present in new member states, not only in the so-called old Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And yes, the local border traffic agreements are something that really problematizes a lot of understandings about how we deal with Ukraine. And the distinction between national and Schengen visas is something we can perhaps clarify further afterwards. Okay, Christian, please.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Vladimir's question about the recreation of the Vienna Congress. Well, I don't think it has any chance to be taken seriously by mainstream political parties, but well, probably it has a certain impact in some intellectual circles and among the sovereignists. This is exactly the kind of things we are discussing in the institute I was mentioning before in Paris, but I don't see how a country like France could accept this kind of things, also because of the consequences for the relation with the United States. I don't believe in that at all. Is Total ignoring sanctions? Well, I don't have precise information on that, but I doubt that Total is going to take a risk like this, because there are some precedents. Most of the business done by Total is done in US dollars, and you know that it has an impact on the way you are treated by the United States. And a bank, BNP, had to pay higher fines a year ago for not respecting some American trade law precisely concerning sanctions vis-à-vis Iran and vis-à-vis Cuba. So I doubt that Total is going to take such a risk. But there is well, a general question which goes beyond Total is the way you bypass sanctions, because everybody knows that there are some possibilities to bypass sanctions. Two countries are extremely interesting for the moment to observe. It's first Belarus. You have a lot of Belarusian food products now on the Russian market, including shrimps, which is interesting for a country which has no sea, and Dubai as well. So, but this is something the political scientists have to investigate a bit more. Well, it goes with illegal activities, and it's not easy to do research on that. Do the French have in mind always the Mediterranean as a sort of social construct? Yes, probably, and this is very interesting, because when you are talking with practitioners in Central Europe, they have another social construct of what is important for us. You know, this is it's very cultural. It has to do with a culturalist approach of who we are. Okay, but then you have also the confrontation with real politics, and the problem of the southern bank of the Mediterranean Sea for the French is what happened in 2011, because you have to remember that the neighborhood policy was set up with a very nice gentleman called Mr. Gaddafi, Mr. Ben Ali, etc. So authoritarian regime at this time, with the idea that, well, it's better to have relationships with them to provide stability than having, well, Islamic threat, etc., etc. And I think all the relationships with the Mediterranean, well, sea and the Mediterranean country has been, of course, totally, well, a new path after 2011. And on the other way, it's clear that it will not make sense for the French to concentrate only on the Middle East and the Mediterranean and neglecting Russia, because the Russia you have other dimension, which is global politics. French is a permanent member of the Security Council, and this is another issue we have to take into consideration, the way we vote. Just to remind you that 70% of the stuff which is dealt with the Security Council is about one region of the world called Africa. Okay? And for a certain number of files like non-proliferation, for instance, it's still important for the French diplomacy to deal with the Russian diplomacy. So it's a balancing act. Okay, but what is officially, of course, expressed as a priority is the South. That's correct. That's correct.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I think this discussion of the culture wars and so on, which has provoked a very good discussion around the room, we can very much relate to the values interests discussion that we have in relation to Europe as well. I mean, Putin, one, attempting to deliver on interests, increase material wealth, some form of law and order, increasingly fails to do so and makes a transition to values, but not just our values necessarily. However, exactly defining this, what our values, their values and so on are, what indeed are Russian values, is a really interesting question to ask. Where do these things actually come from? How do we imagine the community that may inhabit them, and just to make a distinction between other communities? I would invite now, we've got time for a couple more questions, so please raise your hand if you have an interest in commenting or questioning. Nothing was that provocative? Well, perhaps I can put a question to the room in that case. Are the European values, of which the European Union consistently talks about, and which are to some extent understood to be shared amongst European Union member states, compatible with what we might come to understand as Russian values? How might we also see some convergence between these things? That may be something we would like to ask. And where is the work of that done? Is that actually done in the domestic spheres of the EU member states, the wider now transversal domestic sphere of the EU, or is it indeed done as well in the Russian domestic sphere? Do people think there's a potential for convergence with this?
I think we can leave it because we are beyond the schedule.
Oh. So we can discuss it. My apologies, we're actually already slightly beyond the schedule. I've clearly omitted my duty as chair there. I thought we were running until 2 o'clock, so no wonder you didn't have any questions. It's definitely coffee time now. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel for their excellent contributions today, and thank you to you for all your interest.